What if the friendly face you see every day, the one you trust, is hiding a secret so dark it could shatter your reality? What if the food that brings a community together is the very thing that will tear it apart? The story I'm about to tell you is one that will crawl under your skin and stay there. It's a tale of a quaint, forgotten village, a beloved local butcher, and a horrifying discovery that turned neighbors into unwitting cannibals. This is more than just a murder mystery. It's a chilling look into the darkness that can lurk just beneath the surface of everyday life. Before we delve into the heart of this truly terrifying tale, do me a favor and hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications. You won't want to miss a single detail of how this idyllic village became the setting for a nightmare. Now take a deep breath. You're about to enter the village of Havenwood, a place that learned the true meaning of horror, one bite at a time. The village of Havenwood was nestled deep in a valley, cradled by ancient, mist-shrouded mountains that kept the modern world at a comfortable distance. It was a place where time seemed to slow, where the rhythm of life was dictated by the changing seasons rather than the relentless ticking of a clock. The air was clean, the water was pure, and the people were, for the most part, content in their isolation. They were a close-knit community, the kind where everyone knew your name, your business, and your grandmother's secret recipe for apple pie. Life was simple, predictable, and safe, or so they thought. At the heart of the village, on the corner of the cobbled market square, stood Silas's Meats. It wasn't a fancy establishment. The sign above the door was hand-painted, the letters slightly faded by years of sun and rain. But inside it was always bustling. Silas Croft was more than just the village butcher. He was an institution. A large man with a booming laugh and hands the size of dinner plates, Silas had been providing the meat for Havenwood's tables for over 30 years. He had taken over the shop from his father, and it was widely assumed that his son, a quiet, lanky boy named Elias, would one day do the same. Silas was known for his exceptional cuts of meat. His sausages were legendary, his steaks melted in your mouth, and his Sunday roasts were the centerpiece of countless family gatherings. But in the last year, something new had appeared on his counter, something that had the entire village buzzing. He called it his special pork. It was unlike any pork anyone had ever tasted. It was richer, with a subtle sweetness that was both familiar and strangely exotic. It was incredibly tender, falling off the bone with the slightest touch of a fork. Silas was secretive about its origin, simply smiling his broad, gap-toothed smile, and saying it was a new breed he was sourcing from a small, independent farm on the other side of the mountains. The price was reasonable, far more so than its quality would suggest, and soon, Silas's special became a staple in almost every home in Havenwood. The villagers couldn't get enough of it. Martha Gable, who ran the local inn, the Weary Traveler, swore it was the secret to her now-famous stew. The local pastor, Reverend Michael, declared Silas's Sunday roasts to be a gift from God himself. Children who were once picky eaters now devoured their dinners without complaint. The special pork brought a new level of culinary delight to the simple, rustic fare of the village. It became a symbol of their community, something shared and savored, a common thread that ran through their kitchens and their conversations. No one questioned it. Why would they? This was Silas. Trustworthy, jovial Silas, who had given their children candy on their birthdays and had known most of them since they were in diapers. In a world that was growing increasingly uncertain, Silas and his butcher shop were a comforting constant. The first hint that something was amiss came not with a scream, but with a smell. It was a faint, cloying odor that seemed to emanate from the alley behind the butcher shop, particularly on warm, humid evenings. It was a smell that was hard to place, a strange mix of iron and something vaguely sweet, like meat that had just begun to turn, but not in the usual way. Most villagers dismissed it. A butcher shop was bound to have unpleasant smells, after all. They wrinkled their noses, hurried past, and thought no more of it. But young Timmy, the 10-year-old son of the village baker, was a curious boy. His bedroom window faced the back of Silas's shop, and the smell often crept into his room at night, disturbing his sleep. He'd also noticed the strange hours Silas had started to keep. The butcher, who was usually up with the sun, was now often seen working late into the night, the windows of his shop blacked out, a single dim light casting long, dancing shadows against the drawn blinds. And then there were the bonfires. Silas had always had a small incinerator in his backyard for disposing of animal waste, but now he was having large, roaring fires 2 or 3 times a week, always in the dead of night. The smoke from these fires was thick and black, carrying with it that same unsettling, sweet smell. Timmy tried to tell his parents, but they brushed off his concerns. "Silas is a hard worker, son," his father had said, ruffling his hair, "and it's not our place to pry into his business." The disappearances began so subtly that, at first, no one made the connection. Havenwood was a quiet village, but it wasn't entirely cut off from the outside world. It was a popular spot for hikers and campers, drawn by the rugged beauty of the surrounding mountains. Every now and then, a hiker would get lost or a tourist would simply move on without a word. It was a sad, but not entirely uncommon, occurrence. The first was a young woman, a backpacker from the city who had been staying at the inn. She was vibrant and full of life, with a contagious laugh that had charmed everyone she met. She had told Martha Gable she was planning a long hike and would be back in a few days. She never returned. A search party was organized, but the mountains were vast and unforgiving. They found her abandoned tent and a few of her belongings, but of the woman herself, there was no trace. The consensus was that she had fallen victim to the treacherous terrain, a tragic accident. The village mourned her loss and life went on. A few months later, a traveling salesman, a man who passed through Havenwood every year, vanished. His car was found parked on the outskirts of the village, his samples still in the trunk. Again, the police were called, and again, no trace of him was found. This was more unusual, but people reasoned that he must have had debts or a secret life he was running away from. Then, a local man disappeared. Old Man Hemlock, a reclusive figure who lived in a small cottage on the edge of the woods, was known for his long, solitary walks. When he failed to show up at the local pub for his weekly pint, a few of the villagers went to check on him. His cottage was empty, a half-eaten meal still on the table. This time, a real sense of unease began to creep into the village. Old Man Hemlock was strange, but he was one of their own. He wouldn't just leave. It was during the investigation into Hemlock's disappearance that the first concrete clue emerged. Sheriff Brody, a man who had held his post for 20 years and had dealt with little more than stray cows and the occasional pub brawl, was leading the search. He was a thorough, if unimaginative, man. While his deputies scoured the woods, Brody decided to re-interview everyone who had seen Hemlock on the day he disappeared. His last stop was Silas's Meats. Silas was his usual cheerful self, wiping down his counter with a clean, white cloth. "Poor old Hemlock," he said, shaking his head. "Always knew he'd wander off too far one of these days. He was in here, bought some of my special pork. Said it was the only thing that made his old bones feel warm." Brody nodded, making a note in his pad. As he was about to leave, his eyes fell on a small, glittering object on the floor near the meat grinder. He bent down and picked it up. It was a small silver earring, shaped like a feather. He remembered it clearly. The young backpacker, the one who had disappeared months ago, had been wearing a pair just like it. He'd even commented on how pretty they were when he had taken her statement about a minor theft from her room at the inn. "Find something, Sheriff?" Silas asked, his voice still jovial, but with a new, almost imperceptible edge to it. "Just an earring," Brody said, slipping it into his pocket. "Probably belongs to one of your customers." But as he walked out of the shop, a cold dread began to seep into his bones. It was a coincidence, he told himself. A simple, meaningless coincidence. But he couldn't shake the image of the earring, glinting on the blood-stained floor of the butcher shop. That night, Brody couldn't sleep. The earring lay on his bedside table, a silent accusation. He thought about the smell, the late-night fires, the disappearances. He thought about Silas's special pork, the meat that everyone loved, the meat that Old Man Hemlock had bought on the day he vanished. It was all circumstantial, all easily explained away. But the pieces were starting to fit together into a picture so monstrous, so utterly unthinkable, that his mind recoiled from it. He decided to do something he hadn't done in years. He decided to conduct his own unofficial investigation. He waited until well after midnight, until the last light in the village had been extinguished. Then, dressed in dark clothing, he made his way to the back of Silas's butcher shop. The air in the alley was thick with the now familiar sweet, metallic smell. It was stronger here, almost nauseating. A faint light glowed from under the back door of the shop. Brody could hear a low, rhythmic sound coming from inside, a soft, wet, chopping sound. His heart pounding in his chest, Brody crept to the back window. The blinds were drawn, but there was a small tear in the fabric. He peered through the gap. What he saw would haunt his nightmares for the rest of his life. The butcher shop had been transformed into a charnel house. The floor was slick with blood. On the large central chopping block, illuminated by a single bare bulb, lay what was unmistakably a human torso. Silas Croft, his face a mask of grim concentration, was methodically carving away pieces of flesh, his large hands moving with a practiced, terrifying efficiency. He would slice off a piece of meat, trim the fat, and toss it into a large metal tub. The tub was already half full. Brody felt a wave of nausea wash over him. He stumbled back from the window, his hand clamped over his mouth to stifle a cry. He leaned against the cold, brick wall, his body trembling uncontrollably. Silas's special pork. The sweet, tender meat that he and his wife had eaten for dinner just last night. The meat that Martha Gable was serving in her stew. The meat that the entire village had been feasting on for months. It was human flesh. The realization hit him with the force of a physical blow. He felt a violent urge to vomit, to purge himself of the horror he had just ingested. He thought of the smiling faces of his neighbors, blissfully unaware of the abomination they were consuming. He thought of the missing people, their bodies desecrated and served up on the dinner plates of the very community that was now mourning them. In that moment, Sheriff Brody understood the true nature of the evil that had taken root in his peaceful, idyllic village. It was an evil that wore a friendly face, an evil that had been welcomed into their homes and their lives. He knew he had to act, and he had to act fast. But how could he tell them? How could he tell the people of Havenwood that their beloved butcher was a monster, a serial killer who had been feeding them his victims? The truth was so grotesque, so far beyond the realm of their comprehension, that he feared it would shatter their world completely. He ran back to his office, his mind racing. He had to get help. He had to call the state police. This was far beyond his capabilities. As he fumbled for the phone, his eyes fell on a photograph on his desk, a picture of the annual village picnic, taken just last summer. In the center of the photo was Silas, standing behind a large grill, a proud smile on his face as he served up his famous special pork to a crowd of happy, unsuspecting villagers. Brody's own family was in the picture, his wife and daughter, plates piled high, smiling for the camera. A fresh wave of horror washed over him. The apathetic acceptance of his fellow villagers now made a horrifying kind of sense. The sheer volume of Silas's special product should have been a red flag. The village wasn't large, and the amount of this particular cut of meat being sold was disproportionate to any logical supply chain, even from a supposed special farm. But the price was right, the taste was exquisite, and no one wanted to question a good thing. They were complicit in their own ignorance, a collective denial fueled by convenience and a shared, unspoken desire not to disrupt the comfortable rhythm of their lives. He had to get his family out. He had to warn them. But before he could even form a coherent plan, the phone on his desk rang, its shrill cry cutting through the silence of the night. He hesitated for a moment, then picked it up. Sheriff Brody. A frantic voice whispered on the other end. It was Martha Gable from the inn. Sheriff, you have to come quickly. It's the stew. Oh God, the stew. Brody's blood ran cold. Martha, what is it? What's wrong with the stew? A customer, she sobbed, her voice choked with panic. A man from out of town. He found something in his bowl. Something human. The line went dead. Brody dropped the phone, his hand shaking so violently he could barely control it. The secret was out. The nightmare had begun. And he knew, with a certainty that chilled him to the core, that the peaceful, idyllic village of Havenwood would never be the same again. The sweet taste of Silas's meat would forever be replaced by the bitter taste of truth, a truth so horrifying it threatened to consume them all. He grabbed his shotgun from the rack on the wall, his movements stiff and robotic. He had to go back to the butcher shop. He had to confront the monster he had once called a friend. The out-of-towner who had made the gruesome discovery was sitting at a table in the corner, his head in his hands, occasionally muttering to himself. Sheriff Brody took in the scene with a grim, practiced calm he did not feel. On the table, in a now-cold bowl of Martha's famous stew, lay the object of the commotion. It was a human finger, the nail perfectly manicured, a small silver ring still on it. Brody recognized the ring immediately. It belonged to the traveling salesman who had vanished a few months back. The dam of denial that had held the village's fear in check had finally broken. The single, undeniable piece of evidence in the stew bowl was a catalyst, a spark that ignited a firestorm of panic and revulsion. Whispers turned to shouts, and suspicion, once a fleeting, unspoken thought, now became a horrifying certainty. "It's Silas," someone murmured, and the name spread through the room like a virus. It has to be Silas. Brody knew he couldn't contain this on his own. He made the call to the state police, his voice low and urgent, requesting a full investigative team and a forensics unit. He knew that what they would find in Silas's shop would be beyond the scope of his small rural department. While they waited for backup to arrive, Brody, along with a handful of brave, or perhaps foolish, villagers, made their way to Silas's meats. The shop was dark and silent. The back door, which Brody had seen Silas use just hours before, was now locked. A small, handwritten sign hung on the front door, "Closed due to family emergency." The irony was not lost on Brody. The state police arrived just before dawn, their flashing lights painting the quaint village square in surreal shades of red and blue. The team was led by Detective Harding, a sharp, no-nonsense man in his late 40s with a reputation for being one of the best investigators in the state. He listened to Brody's story with a grim, unwavering focus, his expression betraying nothing of the horror of the tale. When Brody finished, Harding simply nodded. "Let's see what we've got," he said, and his team, clad in full protective gear, forced their way into the butcher shop. The scene inside was even more gruesome than Brody had imagined. The shop itself was clean, almost unnaturally so. But the back room, the one Brody had peered into, was a slaughterhouse. Blood was splattered on the walls and ceiling. The large meat grinder was caked with dried blood and what looked like human tissue. And in the walk-in freezer, hanging from meat hooks alongside sides of beef and pork, were the dismembered bodies of at least 3 people. The forensics team went to work, their movements precise and methodical amidst the carnage. Every surface was dusted for prints, every stain was swabbed for DNA. They found a collection of personal items in a locked box under the counter: wallets, keys, jewelry, a chilling collection of trophies from Silas's victims. Among them was the missing earring, the mate to the one Brody had found. But of Silas Croft and his quiet, withdrawn son Elias, there was no sign. They had vanished. The news spread through Havenwood like a plague. The villagers, who had once gathered in the square for festivals and markets, now gathered in hushed, fearful groups, their faces etched with a mixture of horror, disbelief, and a deep, gnawing guilt. The special pork, the meat they had so eagerly consumed, was now a source of collective shame and revulsion. People vomited in the streets. Neighbors who had once shared meals now looked at each other with suspicion and disgust. The very act of eating became a source of trauma. Martha Gable closed her inn, unable to bear the thought of ever serving another meal. The baker, Timmy's father, threw out all of his stock, convinced it was somehow tainted. The church held a special service, but the pews were only half full. Many were too ashamed, too horrified, to face their neighbors, to face the God they believed they had so grievously offended. Detective Harding and his team began the painstaking process of piecing together the timeline of Silas's crimes. They started with the victims, using the personal effects and dental records to identify the bodies in the freezer and to connect Silas to the other disappearances. The young backpacker, the traveling salesman, Old Man Hemlock, they were all accounted for. But there were other, older items in the box, suggesting that Silas's reign of terror had begun long before anyone had noticed. Harding's investigation led him down a dark and twisted path into the history of the Croft family. He learned that Silas's father, the original owner of the butcher shop, had been a strange, secretive man. There were rumors, long since dismissed as village gossip, of his involvement in a strange, backwoods cult that had once existed in the mountains, a cult that was said to practice ancient, dark rituals. He also learned about Silas's son, Elias. The boy had always been an outcast, a quiet, almost invisible presence in the village. He was relentlessly bullied at school, and Silas, for all his outward joviality, was said to be a harsh and demanding father. Elias had been his father's apprentice, learning the butcher's trade from a young age. He had been there, day in and day out, in the shop where his father committed his unspeakable acts. The question that hung heavy in the air was, what did Elias know? And was he a victim or a participant? The investigation took a strange turn when Harding, acting on a hunch, ordered the exhumation of Silas's wife, who had died a few years earlier, officially from a sudden illness. The autopsy revealed traces of a rare, fast-acting poison in her system. The pieces of the puzzle were starting to form a picture of a man who was not just a killer, but a monster in every sense of the word. Meanwhile, the psychological toll on the village was immense. A team of counselors was brought in, but the trauma was too deep, too pervasive. The people of Havenwood were forced to confront a truth that was almost impossible to accept. They had been cannibals. The knowledge tainted every memory, every shared meal, every celebration. The village, once a symbol of peace and community, was now a place of shame and horror. The media descended on Havenwood, their cameras and microphones capturing the raw, unfiltered grief of the villagers. The story of the cannibal butcher of Havenwood became a national sensation, a macabre tale of small-town horror. The village was no longer a haven. It was a freak show, its residents the unwilling stars of a real-life horror story. Days turned into weeks, and still, there was no sign of Silas or Elias. The manhunt was one of the largest in the state's history, but the mountains that had once been Havenwood's protector now served as the perfect hiding place for the fugitives. It was Timmy, the baker's son, who provided the next breakthrough. The boy, who had been withdrawn and silent since the news broke, finally told Sheriff Brody about the late-night fires, the blacked-out windows, and the secret cellar door he had once seen Silas open in the alley behind the shop. Brody and Harding immediately went to investigate. The cellar door was well hidden, concealed beneath a pile of old crates and barrels. It was locked, but the state police quickly forced it open. A wave of cold, damp air, thick with the smell of death and decay, rushed out to meet them. They descended the steep, stone steps into the darkness, their flashlights cutting through the gloom. The cellar was a testament to the true depths of Silas's depravity. It was a torture chamber, a place where he had kept his victims before he killed them. Chains were bolted to the walls, and the floor was stained with old, dried blood. In one corner, they found a small, makeshift altar, adorned with strange, occult symbols. And on the altar, a collection of human bones, arranged in a bizarre, ritualistic pattern. The old rumors about Silas's father and the mountain cult were not just rumors, after all. But it was what they found in a small, locked room at the back of the cellar that truly horrified them. It was a makeshift bedroom, sparsely furnished with a small cot and a single, bare bulb. On the wall, scrawled in what looked like charcoal, were a series of drawings, crude, childlike depictions of violence and death, of a large, monstrous figure and a small, cowering boy. And in a small, leather-bound journal on the bedside table, they found the story of Elias Croft, written in a cramped, shaky hand. The journal was a harrowing account of a life lived in the shadow of a monster. Elias wrote of the abuse he had suffered at the hands of his father, of the relentless bullying, of his mother's slow, agonizing death. He wrote of the other meat, the secret his father had forced him to keep since he was a small boy. He described in chilling detail the first time his father had brought a victim into the cellar, the first time he had been forced to watch, and then to participate in the butchering. The journal was a confession, but it was also a cry for help, a testament to a soul that had been twisted and broken by years of unimaginable horror. Elias was not a monster. He was a victim, a prisoner of his father's madness. The last entry in the journal was dated the night of the discovery at the inn. "He knows they're coming," Elias wrote. "He says we have to go back to the mountain, back to where it all began. He says the old ones will protect us. I'm scared. I don't want to go, but I have no choice. I'm his son. I'm part of him. There's no escape." The journal gave Harding the final piece of the puzzle. The cult, the rituals, the mountain, it all pointed to a specific location, a place deep in the oldest, most inaccessible part of the mountains, a place the locals called the Devil's Maw. A heavily armed tactical team was assembled. They would go into the mountains at first light. The hunt for Silas Croft was no longer just a search for a fugitive. It was a journey into the heart of a darkness that had been festering for generations. As the village of Havenwood held its breath, waiting for news, a new and even more terrifying question began to surface. Silas was a monster, but was he a monster of his own making? Or was he the product of something older, something darker, something that still lived in the ancient, mist-shrouded mountains that surrounded them? The bitter truth had been revealed, but the full extent of the horror was yet to be discovered. The story of Havenwood was not just about a cannibal butcher. It was about a legacy of evil, a darkness that had been passed down from father to son, a darkness that was now waiting, in the heart of the mountains, for its final bloody chapter to be written. The villagers could only pray that the coming dawn would bring an end to their nightmare, and not a new, even more terrifying, beginning. The ascent into the Devil's Maw was treacherous. The tactical team, led by Detective Harding and guided by a reluctant Sheriff Brody, navigated a barely there trail that snaked its way through dense, primordial forest. The air grew colder, the light dimmer, as they ventured deeper into the mountains, leaving the wounded village of Havenwood far below. There was a palpable sense of unease among the men, a feeling that they were treading on unholy ground. The ancient trees seemed to watch them with a silent, malevolent intelligence, and the wind whispered through the branches like the ghosts of the damned. Elias's journal had been their map, its pages filled with chillingly accurate descriptions of the twisted, gnarled landscape. He had written of this place with a mixture of terror and a strange, almost reverent awe. It was here, he wrote, that his grandfather had first communed with the old ones, the dark entities the cult worshipped. It was here that the seeds of the Croft family's madness had been sown. They found the entrance to the cave system late in the afternoon. It was a gaping fissure in the side of the mountain, a dark, gaping maw that seemed to exhale a foul charnel house stench. The rocks around the entrance were stained with old, dried blood and adorned with the same strange, occult symbols they had found in Silas's cellar. This was the place, the heart of the darkness. Harding split his team into two groups. One would secure the perimeter, while he, Brody, and a small, heavily armed team would venture into the cave. As they entered the oppressive darkness, their high-powered flashlights cutting through the gloom, they were met with a scene of unimaginable horror. The cave was a natural cathedral of death. The walls were lined with human skulls, their empty eye sockets seeming to follow their every move. Piles of human bones, gnawed and broken, were scattered across the floor. In the center of the main cavern, a massive, crude altar had been carved from the living rock, its surface stained black with the blood of countless sacrifices. This was not just Silas's hiding place. It was the cult's temple, a place of worship that had been used for generations. The evil in Havenwood was far older, far more entrenched than they had ever imagined. They moved deeper into the cave, their boots crunching on the bone-littered floor. The air was thick with the smell of blood, decay, and something else, something cloyingly sweet, the smell of Silas's special pork. They found him in a smaller cavern at the back of the cave system. He was not the jovial, smiling butcher they had known. He was a wild, primal thing, his clothes torn and stained, his eyes wide with a crazed, fanatical light. He was standing over a small, crackling fire, a crude, sharpened stick in his hand, on which was skewered a piece of meat. And huddled in the corner, his face buried in his hands, was Elias. "Welcome," Silas said, his voice a low, guttural growl that echoed off the cave walls. "You are just in time for the feast. The old ones are hungry." Harding raised his weapon. "It's over, Silas. There's nowhere left to run." Silas let out a booming, insane laugh. "Run? I'm not running. I'm home. This is where I was born. This is where I was made. And this is where I will be reborn." He brandished the stick with the roasting meat. "Have some," he offered, a grotesque parody of his old self. "It's my finest creation, my own flesh and blood." Brody's stomach churned as he realized what Silas was saying. The meat on the stick. It was Elias. He had started to cannibalize his own son. Elias looked up, his face a mask of terror and despair. He said it was the only way," he whimpered. "The only way to become one with them." In that moment, something inside Brody snapped. The years of quiet, small-town policing, the shock of the initial discovery, the guilt of having eaten the flesh of his neighbors, it all coalesced into a single white-hot point of rage. This was not just about bringing a killer to justice. This was about eradicating a cancer, a plague that had infected his home. "You're a monster, Silas," Brody hissed, his voice trembling with a fury he had never known. "We are all monsters," Silas snarled back. "You, me, this whole pathetic village. You all ate it. You all loved it. You begged for more. You are all a part of this. You are all a part of me." He lunged, not at the armed officers, but at Elias, a sharpened piece of rock in his hand. "The final sacrifice must be made," he roared. But before he could reach his son, a single shot rang out, echoing through the cavern. Silas stopped, a look of surprise on his face. He looked down at the red stain blossoming on his chest, then back at the man holding the smoking gun. It wasn't Harding. It was Sheriff Brody. Silas Croft, the cannibal butcher of Havenwood, crumpled to the floor, a low, gurgling sound escaping his lips. And then he was still. Silence descended on the cave, a silence that was broken only by the soft, choked sobs of Elias Croft. The aftermath was a slow, painful process of healing and rebuilding. Elias, who was both a victim and, in some ways, an unwilling accomplice, was taken into protective custody. His journal, along with the horrors found in the cave, painted a clear picture of the psychological torment he had endured. He was eventually sent to a long-term psychiatric facility, his young life forever scarred by the sins of his father. For Havenwood, the road to recovery was long and arduous. The butcher shop was torn down, its foundations salted and burned, as if to purge the very ground of the evil it had housed. The story of Silas Croft became a dark, cautionary tale, a permanent stain on the village's history. The media eventually moved on to the next sensational story, but the scars remained. Some villagers moved away, unable to escape the ghosts of the past. Those who stayed were forever changed. They were more cautious now, more suspicious of their neighbors, of the world, of the very food they ate. The simple, trusting community that had once defined Havenwood was gone forever, replaced by a shared trauma that bound them together in a way that their former happiness never could. Sheriff Brody retired shortly after the incident. He was hailed as a hero, but he never saw himself that way. He was haunted by the faces of the victims, by the memory of the special pork he had eaten, by the knowledge of the darkness that had lurked just beneath the surface of his peaceful town. He had looked into the abyss, and the abyss had looked back at him. Years later, the village of Havenwood was still a quiet place, but it was a different kind of quiet. It was the quiet of a place that had known true horror, a place that understood that the greatest monsters are not the ones that hide in the shadows, but the ones that live among us smiling and friendly until the day they decide to invite you for dinner. The legacy of Silas Croft was a bitter one, a reminder that even in the most idyllic of havens, the seeds of evil can take root, and the sweetest meat can hide the most horrifying of truths. The feast was over, but the taste of it would linger forever in the memory of the village that had, for a time, been a cannibal's paradise.